Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society. Hi, I'm your host, Dawn Carnegas, and joining me to introduce today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the Double Secret Selection Committee that selects all of the guests to appear on STEM Talk.
Hi, Don. Great to be here. Today's interview with Jim Stray Gundersen on blood flow restriction training is a great topic, and it's one of great personal interest for me.
Yeah, his extensive experience between research and applying that research as a world-renowned Olympic and professional coach is a pretty unique combination.
Absolutely. Jim is a fascinating fellow, and the topic of blood flow restriction is one where there is great and growing interest. Unfortunately, there is significant misinformation disseminated on the web and through podcasts on this very topic.
Yeah, surprise, surprise.
Absolutely. What a shocker. On a more personal note, I've been using blood flow restriction for the past several years to excellent effect, and I've sort of drunk the Kool-Aid on this one.
Well, before we get to today's interview with Jim, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who subscribe to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews piling up on iTunes. So I have it on good authority that the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing the iTunes reviews with an eye towards selecting the wittiest and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk.
Your source is correct. The committee never tires from its task and is constantly toiling in that regard.
That's a good thing. As always, if you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review was posted by someone who goes by the nickname Jocelyn RM, and the winning review is entitled, "I Feel My Brain Making Many More Connections While I Listen."
It's a great title, by the way.
It's a great title. I hope that's really what's happening. This is my favorite podcast ever. I love the choices that the Double Secret Selection Committee makes. Colin Champ, Kirk Parsley, Rob Wolf, Dom DiAgostino. Wow. I feel my brain making many more connections while I listen. Or maybe that's all the ketones flooding my brain, as recommended by a few of your guests. Love, love, love.
Well, thank you, Jocelyn RM, and thank you to all the other STEM Talk listeners who have helped STEM Talk get off to such a great start.
Okay, now on to today's interview with Dr. Jim Stray Gundersen.
Jim Stray Gundersen received his board certification in general surgery in 1985. He then completed fellowships in cardiovascular physiology and human nutrition at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical School, where he received appointments as associate professor of orthopedic surgery and physiology.
Jim's primary interests and areas of research are broad and varied, but they all revolve around maximizing human performance, health, and resilience. He pioneered an altitude training protocol, otherwise known as Live High, Train Low. In addition, he has played a key role in the development of the anti-doping test, SAFE, which stands for Safe and Fair Events, SAFE.
Since 1984, Jim has worked with numerous Olympians in various sport disciplines, advising on training for maximal human performance, and has an ongoing relationship with the great runner and director of the Nike Oregon Project, Alberto Salazar.
He has been an official physician consultant of the United States, Norwegian, and Canadian Olympic teams, and is an official member of over 15 World Championships. And he leads the high-low training for the U.S. Athletic Trust.
Jim has served on international medical committees that include the International Olympic Committee, FIFA, International Biathlon Committee, International Ski Federation, International Skating Union, World Anti-Doping Association, and the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency.
Dr. Stray Gundersen is the Sports Science Director for the United States Ski and Snowboard Association and continues to lead human performance and altitude camps for Olympic athletes, Masters athletes, as well as Navy SEALs to optimize human performance.
He also runs the SG Performance Medicine Center and Sport Technologies for maximal athletic performance, overall fitness, weight loss, and recovery in both Texas and Utah.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
Hi, I'm Dawn Carnegas, and welcome to STEM Talk. Today we have Jim Stray Gundersen joining us. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
And we also have Dr. Ken Ford joining us today.
Hi, Dawn. Great to be here and great to speak with you, Jim.
So, Jim, let's start at the beginning and discuss how did you first get interested in science?
I first got interested in science when I was a little kid, probably, 6, 7, 8 years old. I was a bored little hellion in the class, and my teacher took exception to my behavior and sent a report home to my mother saying that I was going to flunk third grade or whatever it was, and that I better get my act together. And so my mother and my teacher ganged up on me and started seeing what things were of interest. And I ended up getting into study of insects and collecting bugs and doing all sorts of stuff. And I think that was the initial foray into an interest in biology and chemistry and physiologic or biologic sciences in the first place. And that led to all sorts of things. I was trapping and classifying animals, and it ended up in my college major was ethology or animal behavior within the zoology department of the University of Wisconsin. And we were doing all sorts of things that at least captivated my interest and kept my energies confined in positive ways.
That's good if you can channel that energy in a positive direction. What's the commentary? Well-behaved people rarely make history, I think is the saying. So
or idle hands are the devil's workshop.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Same concept.
Yeah, there's a story about you having to do with doorknobs or some such thing.
Yeah, where'd you find that one?
Yeah, the Double Secret Selection Committee does deep background investigations.
You must, because I don't know where you would have found that one or anybody who knew about that.
Now he's scared.
Yeah, you must have called my mom up or something.
Yes, we have resources.
I ended up taking my bedroom door apart, and I couldn't get it back together, which presented some form of a problem for me getting in and out of my bedroom as well as my parents.
When you were young, were you an athlete early in life? I know later in life you were very interested in sports, but is it early?
So my dad came over to the States from Norway after World War II, and he came to an small American college in Wisconsin called Beloit. And he had a track scholarship, and he ran middle distance running for them and did quite well. And then his uncle, my grandfather's brother, had won a gold medal in the 1924 Olympics in the decathlon. And so there was always, and the other thing growing up in Wisconsin is we had the Green Bay Packers. So
Go Packers.
Yeah, right. And Vince Lombardi, it was in the Vince Lombardi years. And so all of these things kind of came together. And particularly with my dad, there was a tremendous interest in sports and watching sports and then doing them. And my dad was quite accomplished. And I kind of naturally kind of fell into that whole effort. At the same time, my mother was very education oriented, and she has a uncle who is a professor in English at Boston University, and a lot of I think in my mother's father's high school class, my grandfather was the valedictorian, and Ernest Hemingway was the third person in the class. So there was a lot of emphasis on education and academia and that thing coming from my mother, while there was an interest in sports and athletics coming from my dad. And I kind of drifted into both of those. In the education one, more kicking and screaming along the way, but that's kind of how those things developed. And so I remember when I must have been, 9, something like that. My dad held a track meet for my birthday party, and all my friends were there, and all this kind of stuff. And he had put out with flour. He had made lanes and all this kind of stuff, and then I ended up winning every race, and I was crushed because my dad said, "Well, you can't win the prizes. These are all your friends here, and it'd be kind of an insult if I just gave all the prizes to you. So you're not getting anyone. I'm just giving the trophies to the second place person in all these races."
Well, he was ahead of his time.
Yeah, well, I was really offended by all this. I said, "Hey, listen, I won these fair and square. What's going on?" And but anyway,
Yeah. That's a whole generation of kids raised like that now. Well, you came in last, but you participated. And, here's your gold medal.
Yeah.
Hey, Jim, you mentioned that you studied ethology when you were in undergrad and you studied animal behavior. Actually, those were some of my favorite courses when I was in undergrad. I was actually a zoology major initially at NC State. How did you jump from that to medicine?
As it kind of happened after the talking to from my mother and my teacher at the time, I end up just finding sciences easy in school and did well at them without really trying very hard at all. And I liked objective tests, and because then I wouldn't have to argue with the teacher about why I got a C for writing some paper. And so I drifted into the sciences, and then when I went from high school to Madison, it was kind of open-ended, and you can do what it is you want to do. And so I started taking those things. I had gotten very interested in zoology along the way, and as well as anatomy and physiology and some other things. I remember a comparative anatomy course in vertebrate biology that was really a lot of fun. I guess partially I had the interest, and partially I attracted the attention of my professors, and I ended up doing a couple of small research projects, one of which got me into trouble, actually. But that led to an interest, and my main professor there was a Jack Haleman, who was into ornithology and in particular ethology in terms of the pattern behavior that you find in birds compared to the more open chain thing that you find in mammals. I graduated from college in '74. We still had the draft. Vietnam was still going on. And I had been encouraged by my professors to go to grad school. And then my mother, my uncle, my mother's brother, was a physician. And I had not really thought about med school much before this, but then I kind of just did an analysis and said, well, I really like biologic sciences and this kind of thing, and I can go to grad school in zoology and maybe be a park ranger out in Yellowstone one of these years, or I could go to med school and then I could be a doctor, and then I could live pretty much where I wanted to live. And at the same time, this interest in, I would say vertebrate biology was extending into then fine-tuning into human biology. That led me to apply to med school, and I got in, and that seemed like a good thing to do rather than submit myself for the draft, and off I went. So
then you chose general surgery for your residency. What drove that decision?
I went to Loyola Stritch School of Medicine, and at the time we were finishing med school in 12 quarters instead of 12 semesters or 8 semesters or whatever it is. And so I ended up doing med school in 3 years, and really the basic science portion was really just the first 4 quarters or the first year. And so I found myself 1 year out of college and having to think about what kinds of residencies or programs that I wanted to do. And, I really didn't know. My uncle had been a radiologist, and I thought that was cool and all that kind of stuff. So I really didn't know what to do. And our basic clerkships, the first, what would be the third year typically, but was my second year, one of those was a big one in surgery. And then I also had ones in medicine pediatrics, and a variety of other things. And I was really attracted to surgery for a couple reasons. One was that um, you were able to solve problems. Someone would present with a problem. If it turned out there was a surgical solution, you could go ahead and do that. A good example is appendicitis. Somebody comes into the emergency room, they have abdominal pain. If you don't do the right things with it, they can die. But you are in a position to think through the problem and have a solution, and then carry out that solution, and then have somebody say, "Thanks, doc." And that was very rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the professors I had in surgery at Loyola were outstanding individuals. I took a liking to them, and they took a liking to me. Another facet of this whole thing is a little bit of the athletics. There's a certain amount of neuromotor skill that's required to be a good surgeon, and a certain mental outlook to be able to come into these really severe, life-threatening situations and be calm about it and problem solve and carry out the solutions. And I was kind of good at those things, and I like doing those things. And so that's what led me into surgery.
It just seemed like a really good fit for you. So then you eventually moved into sports performance. So what led you to that transition?
So another thread throughout my life had been this biological research thread. Towards the end of my residency, I had started doing a few clinical research projects that were well received and of interest. Then towards the end of my residency, what's next? The thought was to do some postdoctorate fellowships in something that was cardiovascular related, with the intent of, maybe publishing a few papers and then going on and doing a vascular fellowship and that as a career. And I ended up meeting Jerry Mitchell, Dr. Jerry Mitchell at UT Southwestern in Dallas, and he invited me down for an interview to look at a postdoc fellowship. It was in the Department of Cardiology, but it also had an exercise physiology bent to it. This was just what I had been looking for in terms of satisfying the athletic facet of my interest. When I had gone to med school and residency, all that stuff more or less went out the window. There was no time for any of it. But now all of a sudden I could look into, again, getting back to this whole idea of, well, this is curious, how does this thing work? That was essentially what exercise physiology, and I did a fellowship in cardiovascular physiology and then another one in human nutrition. Again, now what's happening to me in this time period is I'm, on one hand, I have sort of been this general surgeon, but now I'm in a position where I'm having to think of other tools to affect health and fitness, and those tools being exercise and nutrition. And they tend to be a little more gentle than a scalpel. I just kind of morphed into that, and again, I really liked it, and I was my efforts were well received. I ended up being on the faculty in the departments of cardiology and orthopedics at UT Southwestern for about 18 years.
Well, you certainly have demonstrated a fine talent at reinventing yourself.
Yeah. So, it gets back to having an interest in sports when I'm, like 8, and an interest in biology or zoology or ethology or medicine or physiology, also around that time. And it just took me a while to end up getting to do what I was supposed to be doing.
Yeah, what's interesting is most of the successful people that I've met, I've sat around a table recently at a dinner with a number of different physicians, surgeons, researchers, and we were talking about our paths, and everybody had a very unique and wandering path. And I know that Ken can say the same thing. So it definitely defines that you're doing exactly what you want to be doing. So that's great. So, Jim, let's move on to the topic of blood flow restriction exercise. For those in our listening audience, can you explain what this entails?
Yes. Blood flow restriction exercise is doing relatively easy exercises with really a restriction of venous outflow out of the extremities. How technical do you want me to be here? Is this for an explanation for the layperson?
As technical as you like.
Okay. Well, we might basically some form of belt or band or cuff is put on the proximal portions of the arms and or the legs at different times. This cuff doesn't really do much at rest. And normally when we go from rest to exercise, we increase blood flow into the extremity that's exercising. The properly adjusted cuff ends up delaying or restricting the amount of blood flow that the exercising muscle can get. And so you set up this metabolic crisis or this disturbance of homeostasis with very easy exercise where the working muscle is requiring a certain amount of blood flow to maintain the activity, and these cuffs or bands or belts or wraps are not allowing that blood to get to the muscle in sufficient quantities to keep homeostasis going in that muscle. And this particular crisis has two effects. One, there's a local effect. We know that if we drop the PO2 and we drop the pH in a cell, that stimulates protein synthesis and upregulates these activities such that the cell that's in this condition tries to improve its ability to tolerate this disturbance of homeostasis. At the same time, our nervous system is sensing what's going on in the body. And so in this case, it's very much like athletes when they're listening to their body, they're knowing how the various parts are functioning. Here, we create a situation where there's maybe a muscle burn or fatigue sets in, and the CNS is aware of this. And the CNS then tries to do something about it. Part of it goes through the autonomic nervous system, and you have an increase in sympathetic tone, you have an increase in heart rate, increase in ventilation, increase in sweating that are out of proportion to the work being done. And they're doing this because they're getting this signal that literally all hell's breaking loose in the exercising tissues. And in addition to that autonomic response, there's also a more long-term, call it recovery or repair or some cascade and constellation of various hormones that are stimulated from the brain that are coming out and facilitating the repair process and the rebuilding process that's going on in any of these tissues that we're exercising. And so one of the things that's been documented is there's very good data showing that VEGF is increased with blood flow restrictive training and vascular endothelial growth factor, and that is one of the markers of an angiogenic stimulus. So blood flow restriction training provides an angiogenic stimulus to all tissues that we're exercising. So starting over a little bit and a little bit more simply is what blood flow restriction training is. It's the idea of doing light, easy exercise in a particular pattern with primarily venous return being restricted. And this sets up a situation where the easy exercise turns into being maximal exercise, and fatigue sets in, and then that fatigue signal ends up causing repair and recovery adaptations.
That's great. It's important that we note for the audience that it's called blood flow restriction training, not blood flow occlusion training. What are your thoughts on the degree of restriction stimulus necessary to safely achieve very strong or close to optimal results?
So the real answer is where you get fatigue and failure in the working muscle ends up being the right amount of restriction, because you're looking for that fatigue and failure sign to make sure you're getting this systemic response. Different width cuffs, different amounts of pressure, different kinds of people, all these sort of things take different combinations of pressure to get to this ideal state where failure happens. And so this is one of the big confusions in the literature and between different companies with different kinds of hardware, because they all end up doing it slightly different ways. And one group saying, well, there's no way you can go and do those things at such low pressures. And the other one's saying, well, you can't do them at these high pressures and, cause all sorts of problems and on and on and on. And the explanation that usually happens for most of these things, when there's a whole bunch of people arguing about something, the truth somewhere in the middle with all this, and usually people are right about what they're saying. It's just that they're not saying it in a way that's communicating with the other one. But in some of the bigger systems, they go to a certain percentage of the person's systolic blood pressure. But in other systems, whatever the blood pressure is irrelevant to the situation, because it's really just the pressure in the band and how much it is influencing or restricting or impeding the venous return, which is very difficult to measure. So it's easier to measure arterial blood flow in an extremity. To get the venous, it should be the same as the venous outflow, and it needs to be over time. But there's all these kind of subtle mismatches in timing between what an artery is pumping in and what is coming out of these things. In many ways, you can think of the proper application of restriction as putting in a dam that periodically is overflown by what in our case would be muscle contraction. So let's say you put a venous dam. You could ideally just take your fingers and pinch that big central vein and say, okay, no blood's getting through there. And then somebody does a bicep curl or a hand grip, and that generates a certain amount of pressure that pushes that venous blood past the obstruction on the vein. And that's really what we're looking at. So the artery is not so much impeded. The artery's pumping away. But there's enough pressure in there so that the venous outflow is made either very little or completely obstructed at a certain time point. And then muscle contraction itself ends up squeezing this venous blood past the restriction. And in that way, changing the character of the venous flow from kind of a lazy river, if you will, to one in which the flow goes down to near zero, and then one where it goes even higher than normal flows to kind of catch up and make up for this thing as the muscle is pushing this blood past the obstruction.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
So, Jim, from what I understand, blood flow restriction exercises typically entails a relatively high rep protocol, but I've also seen in other literature other rep schemes suggested. Do you have any comments on different protocols for different applications?
The protocols that I use come from Dr. Seto, and through that work, and who's the guy who came up with this in the first place. And I think his protocols are really right on. And basically it entails 3 sets of various numbers of reps, usually anywhere from 20 to 30, somewhere in that ballpark. So you could end up doing 90 reps of a given exercise, which is relatively a lot compared to, let's say, 10. The reason for that is severalfold. One is you want to have a very easy exercise in absolute terms that then you're putting this blood flow restriction in place on top of that, which ends up making it maximal. So if you were really doing heavy maximal lifting in the first place, you just couldn't get enough of these reps in to get the metabolic crisis to unfold in the working tissues. So you have to have enough time or be able to do enough reps and enough time to create these metabolic conditions that are the stimulus for adapting.
That makes sense. So should blood flow restriction training be periodized?
Of course, yes. And it both in terms of what you're doing with just blood flow restriction training, but also in terms of whatever other training is going on. It's one thing for, let's say, baby boomers who this is the only thing they're doing. And in that case, it's very easy to say, okay, we're going to do this 3 times a week. We're going to give you a bunch of rest in between. As we go, we build up in terms of what the weights are. We build up in terms of what the pressures are. We may include more exercises as you get better and better at this. When you're talking about athletes who are already doing a lot of other forms of training, you need to weave this stuff into their programs in such a way that you don't overwhelm the situation. It does get periodized and individualized like any form of training.
And you had mentioned the inventor of blood flow restriction training, Dr. Seto. Can you talk a little bit about the beginnings of this type of exercise?
Yeah, he came up with this 50 years ago in Japan.
Wow.
In his mind, he had been at a funeral service where he had to sit in a situation where his legs were bent underneath his body weight, and he had to sit there for this period of time. And like in our experience, sometimes if you get in these positions, your leg falls asleep or whatever. Mm-hmm. Whatever had happened to him. When he was finished with it, he said, wow, my muscles feel like they do when I've worked out really hard. And he started thinking about that. As he was kind of mulling all this stuff over, then he ended up going on a ski vacation in the Japanese mountains. And he ended up falling and hurting himself and getting a fracture in his ankle and injuring his knee. And in those days, everywhere, they would just put you in a cast, mm-hmm. a long leg cast, and with the expecting to get a lot of atrophy over time, but the bones would heal. He didn't like that idea of sitting still, so he started putting various straps, judo belts, bicycle inner tubes, a variety of things around the top of his leg on the injured side, essentially doing the first blood flow restriction training. In those days, it was the routine to change the cast at 6 weeks because typically what had happened, there had been so much atrophy that now the cast didn't fit tight and you weren't keeping the fracture solid or fixed, if you will. And so they took the cast off him, and his leg was as good as new with all of his muscles without any atrophy. And they said, well, what have you been doing? He said, well, I've been putting these straps on. And it's also indicative of what he calls this. He calls this katsu, which in Japanese is kind of 2 words. Ka meaning additional and atsu meaning pressure. And so he thinks of this in terms of adding or additional pressure on, in this case, now we know the veins, and such that this exercise that he was just doing in his cast, where he would, do isometric stuff and resist against the cast and that kind of thing, was enough for him to mitigate the atrophy that was supposed to happen with this. And the doctors were amazed and all that sort of stuff. So he thought he was onto something. And so he just decided to keep experimenting on himself and some others. And it took him a while to develop this, but probably in over 30 years, he got to where he had a particular set of bands that he liked. And around the turn of the century is when he first started automating this stuff with the various devices that Steve Munatonis and Katsu Global sell at this time. And so really, there was a lot of, he had an epiphany. He made a few observations on himself, and then he started systematically studying this. And with help at the University of Tokyo Medical Center and some colleagues there, Dr. Nakajima and Dr. Morito, they have ended up producing a wide-ranging set of studies and work, and really starting the literature or the scientific approach to this kind of thing.
That's brilliant. So you had mentioned that you felt like his protocol that he's developed over time is probably the optimal protocol. Have you ever had the chance to meet him in person?
Oh, yes. I've been over to Japan several times to meet with him and learn from him. And then through Steve Munatonis, I've been able to, we've all worked together. Steve is fluent in Japanese. My Japanese is horrible. And Dr. Sato's English is passable. But between the three of us, we're able to communicate. And Dr. Sato has visited here in the States as well.
So I've heard safety concerns raised by physicians that were worried about blood flow restriction training aggravating things like hypertension or even causing something like deep vein thrombosis. Can you talk about the legitimacy of these concerns, and also is blood flow restriction exercise counterindicated for any group with a pre-existing condition?
Actually, the shorter answer is there are no concerns.
Yeah.
And there are no contraindications.
Great.
Getting a little bit more involved in it, people, I think, associated with putting a tourniquet on as creating a condition of venous and eventually venous and arterial and capillary stasis of blood, which is a risk factor for deep venous thromboses. And in addition, there's Virchow's triad, where you need stasis, you need endothelial damage, and you need some other predisposing factor that's doing this to initiate a clotting response. You don't have those things with blood flow restriction training. So as we were talking a little bit about this idea of never occluding and really altering venous flow to go from almost a pulsatile venous flow, where flow goes from very low levels to very high levels, and you've distended the veins distal to the bands or belts. And so what happens is you're backing up, like as you have this model of a dam, you have this lake that's being created, which is distending the blood vessels and everything else. And then you have muscle contraction, which is clearing all this stuff out at very high rates of flow, none of which do you have any endothelial damage going on. So you don't have the requirements to cause these deep venous thromboses in the first place. There's been one study in Japan that has looked at the incidence of DVTs in people doing katsu. In this study, they surveyed 12,642 individuals who had done something like 33,000 katsu sessions. They found there were 6 DVTs in this group. And this group included, I think, approximately a third of the group had been hospitalized, and they had been using BFR training for rehabilitation in hospital settings. The incidence of DVTs in these hospitalized settings is like 1 in 100 or something like that.
Wow.
And where what they found in this paper was about 1 in 2,000. There are limitations with the way they collected the data and all these kind of things, and it's not a prospective study. But if anything, it shows that there is a lower incidence of DVTs in populations doing at least katsu training. So thinking more about it with respect to the DVTs, you're missing the requirements for a thrombotic activity. And because of this, Dr. Morito ended up doing a study where he looked at markers of thrombosis and markers of clot lysis. And he did this with 2 different forms of the same kind of exercise under conditions in the same individuals with blood flow restriction and without blood flow restriction. And the comparison ended up showing no significant differences between thrombotic markers and lysing markers. But if anything, there was a tendency to improve the lysing markers, such that, if anything, there's a slight preventative aspect to the use of blood flow restriction for DVTs. And in fact, they use this in Japan for a lot of these coach class clots, where what they do is they do a little BFR session on the airplane, and that ends up helping with that.
I was just, I'm glad to hear that. I was just going to say, I recently got off a long and tedious flight in a not very comfortable seat. I broke out my katsu. And
Did you?
Much to the amazement of my seatmates and subsequently to the flight attendant, I'm afraid. But Yeah, so I hope I was warding off the dreaded DVTs.
There you go. And it makes some sense. So if what you're doing is you're changing this venous flow in the deep system, and you're essentially flushing out the system with every muscle contraction, it's just a good flush. And so there's really no concerns for thrombotic events.
Great.
Now, one of the things to say, though, is that Dr. Seto, in his personal experimentation, ended up having some PEs at one point and a little hemoptysis when he went too far. But this is where a lot of this.
Imagine that.
Yeah. So this thing ended up getting developed by Dr. Seto and his colleagues, and they, through trial and error, found out safe ways of doing this. And the big thing there is you never want to occlude the arterial side of the equation.
No.
And as long as you don't do that, you're safe. And if anything, there's a lower incidence of DVTs than otherwise.
Sure, you can check for a capillary refill rate.
Yes, you can. And if you have them on and you just want to feel your pulse, most people. So with Katsu and the narrower elastic bands, generally we use much higher pressures than are used on the wider cuffs and the non-elastic cuffs and the blood pressure cuffs. And most people are kind of amazed when we're cranking this thing up to 250 millimeters of mercury, and they say, well, aren't you cutting off blood? And he said, no, feel your pulse. And so that gets rid of that relatively quickly. Another complication that has happened on occasion is a diagnosis of rhabdomyolysis. And for those in the audience who aren't familiar with that, it's essentially rhabdomyolysis is a condition where you may have kidney failure or you may have cardiac arrhythmias due to the release of intracellular contents from muscle that is damaged. So you run into these things in car accidents, motorcycle accidents, in some forms of trauma, in crush accidents, as anyone knows, like the first time they try some new exercise, they may be sore the next day or the next 24 to 48 hours after they've done this. That kind of pain is called delayed onset muscle soreness, and that happens under a variety of conditions. If you occlude the circulation and you're lifting heavy weights, you can end up creating damage to these muscles. And if this damage is sufficiently universal, you can end up releasing enough intracellular contents into the circulation that you can both get a diagnosis of rhabdomyolysis, which is done by drawing some blood and seeing what the level of CK is in the blood. And it's felt that if it's over 1,000, which is not normal, that gives you your diagnosis. There's one other thing you talked about, contraindications or people who shouldn't do this. So one of the things that works there is women who have had a mastectomy and may have had radiation or an axillary node dissection to their axilla. That ends up being a contraindication to take blood pressure on that side. And in an abundance of caution, we don't recommend doing blood flow restriction on that extremity. Similar sorts of situations are in hemodialysis where people have arteriovenous fistulas on one arm or a leg or someplace. The solution there is to, the other three extremities are fair games to get the systemic effect. So they can exercise and do blood flow restriction training. They just don't do it with that extremity that has had those problems. Another kind of relative contraindication is pregnancy. So if someone is doing blood flow restriction training and they end up noting they're pregnant, well, they've been doing it all the way through the first trimester and everything else, so it's fine to continue. But what we don't do, we don't recommend women starting blood flow restriction training in the middle of being pregnant. out of an abundance of caution and to not really rock the boat so much. And then when they deliver, then they can pick it up at that time.
You mentioned rhabdo arising from the use of heavy weights with blood flow restriction. And traditionally in the resistance training world, it's been taken as received wisdom that using loads of less than, 65 or 70% of the trainee's one repetition max would not result in significant muscle hypertrophy. And yet we see great results, with BFR. And I wondered if you would take a moment to talk a little bit about the use of the light weights. You've explained the mechanism nicely and how one uses BFR, but when we say light weights, we're talking about really light weights. And I was wondering if you'd elaborate on that for a minute.
Yeah, partial body weight or full body weight. Sometimes barbells, like 5-pound barbells, maybe 10-pound barbells. This one rep max business is that's what has been used in a number of the studies that have tried to describe this. And in those particular studies, they are able to get a 1 rep max for somebody's bench press or somebody's arm curl or something like that. But when you're talking about the way these things are used for, let's say, doing push-ups or whatever, this 1 rep max concept is not workable. What they do say from the 1 rep max is that somewhere between 20 and 30% of your 1 rep max is the area that's defined as easy exercise. Now, we want to use a relatively light load so that we can get sufficient reps and a number of sets so that the area under the curve of this signal going into the brain is relatively robust. And you have to use light weights to do that. Mm-hmm. If you use heavy weights, you end up tearing up the tissue and creating an environment for rhabdo. What we want to do is we want to set up this metabolic crisis in the working muscle, but as such that the first motor units stimulated end up having to drop out, and then we have to recruit a greater and greater percentage of the motor units in that muscle to just get the job done. And so in this way, like we used to with marathon running, you run the first 20 miles to, deplete your endurance fibers, and then you have to run the last 10K on your fast twitch muscle. And what you do is you have this metabolic crisis going on in these fatigue-resistant fibers because you've kept the blood flow less than they want coming into this thing. And then what happens is they start dropping out, and then you have to recruit these more fatigable fibers to just get the job done. And they fatigue even earlier. And so before you know it, you've got the whole muscle, all the motor units in the muscle contracting, and all of them getting into metabolic trouble, just like you do with maximal work. So now here we've gotten this situation where, maybe ideally it's 80 to 90% of 1 rep max that you need to get significant adaptation and hypertrophy. We've created the same metabolic situation by just restricting the venous blood flow that these muscles are able to get.
That's a nice description in a recent 2016 paper that appeared in Sports Medicine. It reported that muscle size and strength increases are observed even in muscles not directly under blood flow restriction, that is, muscles proximal to the applied pressure. And how extensive is this effect, and is it associated with, or can the effect be heightened by variations in exercise protocol?
Well, so here's the big secret. So we're doing a paradigm shift here. Most of us were taught that if you wanted to get a muscle stronger, you had to exercise that muscle. And here we're using some muscles that are distal to the band or the cuff to stimulate growth in all muscles used during that exercise. So a good example is, let's take a bench press where you're using your pecs and you're using your triceps to move the weight. And the triceps have their blood flow restricted, but the pecs sure don't. They're a proximal muscle, and their vascular supply is proximal to any of these bands. And people have done EMG studies where they've looked at the integrated EMG that comes out of both the pecs and the triceps. And what happens as you go through these sets of exercises and the fatigue sets in, you end up having a greater and greater integrated EMG signal indicating that you're contracting, or the brain is trying to get more and more of the motor units in this muscle to contract and to contribute to doing the work. And you see this increase in EMG signal in both muscles, proximal and distal to the bands. And so that's one thing. And it's really kind of weird, because let's say you're doing lunges, and sure enough, your quads are telling you they're not happy with things, but also your glutes, which their blood flow is just fine, thank you very much. And so there's I think, and then now I'm getting a little teleologic, but I think what happens is the brain isn't smart enough to know that, oh, the triceps need help, but the pecs are just fine. So it sends out this signal, say, okay, try to do that bench press harder. And it ends up stimulating muscles both proximal and distal to the band. And then the final thing is, so any of these muscles that have been exercised, they end up they now are prepared to receive the systemic hormonal response that's coming their way. And so let's just say it's growth hormone. So this growth hormone coming out of the pituitary is going everywhere. And any muscles that we're exercising, both proximal and distal to the bands, are now going to receive the benefit of this repair and recovery response.
Great. That's a very clear explanation of a somewhat mysterious effect from the perspective of traditional exercise.
And this particular issue has compromised a number of studies. So when they look for controls, they say, okay, well, we'll put the bands on one arm and we'll have both arms doing arm curls. Mm-hmm. And what they find is that the muscles in both arms are improving in strength and size. And then they say, well, blood flow restriction doesn't work because the control arm just got better too. And so the design of these studies needs to be interpreted very carefully to understand that they have the right controls and that they've dealt with this let's say crossover effect of blood flow restriction training. And so the literature is compromised in many, many ways, and you really have to get into it and understand it before you can make much sense of it.
With respect to specific mechanisms of action that have been postulated as causal with respect to the efficacy of blood flow restriction training, there's been just a huge assortment of them thrown out there. We've mentioned a few today, but everything from suppression of FOXO transcription and decreased myostatin expression, increased growth hormone. There's a long, long, long list that we could recite. And you mentioned some of the best ones: increased fast twitch muscle recruitment, just a long list. And I wondered if you could, with your experience, think about that, and if you could just pick, say, three mechanisms of the many that have been suggested in the literature that seem to be the most important and that best explain the positive effects one sees in blood flow restriction training, what would be the three? If you just, if you said I had to pick three.
The first perturbation is impeding venous return in the right way, such that you get this disturbance of homeostasis in the working muscle, which has a local mechanism, whether it's mTOR pathway or whatever, and whether you end up recruiting all the motor units in the muscle. All these things contribute. So there's a local mechanism operative that ultimately increases in protein synthesis. There's a variety of studies that looked at increasing mRNA and a variety of other things. I think at this point, we don't know for sure with all these things. And then there's this systemic response. where information about this disturbance of homeostasis is getting into the CNS, and the CNS is responding to this. And that mechanism is a combined autonomic and hormonal one, in which growth hormone is a very good marker to suggest that this is occurring.
Let's talk a little bit about growth hormone. When I first ran into blood flow restriction, it was presented to me that the primary causal agent was probably a massive release in growth hormone. And recently, I think it was this year or last year, and it made sense to me. This year or last year in Stu Phillips' lab at McMaster University, they've really come out strongly challenging the notion that local growth hormone directly potentiates muscle growth. And I was wondering if, in the context of blood flow restriction, if you could talk about that a little.
So what happens, and why I think we know that there's afferent traffic into the CNS. The growth hormone that is released, along with other things, is coming out of the pituitary gland, which got stimulated by the hypothalamus to secrete this stuff. And there's very clear data on that this happens very robustly with blood flow restriction training. Now, okay, so yes, there's growth hormone circulating, and yes, there's increased IGF-1 coming out of the liver in response to this pulse of growth hormone. And yes, there's an upregulation of protein synthesis in the muscles that have been working. And all these things have been demonstrated. And in my mind, we know that growth hormone does facilitate protein synthesis in muscle or in a variety of tissues. And so that to me, it stands to reason that at the very least, this is part of the mechanism that's operative here.
It'd be really interesting to look at. And so just kind of staying on that same theme of, omics, genetics, genomics, has anybody ever done metabolomic analysis after blood flow restriction training?
No, but we were about to.
Oh, okay.
Some colleagues at Harvard who had a Metanomics profile where they use HPLC to look at 400 different metabolites that are coming out of a muscle during exercise. And we have in the planning stages to do a trial with blood flow restriction training, but hasn't happened yet.
Well, that sounds like a really interesting piece of work to be done in the future.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
As the baby boomer generation, of which I am a member in good standing.
Me too.
Yes, indeed. As we continue to mature, there is a growing interest in fending off sarcopenia, the age-related loss of lean muscle mass, strength, and functionality.
Ken, I really like the phrase "continuing to mature." That's putting it nicely.
Well, thank you, Don.
Yeah, my line there is, I may be old, but I'm immature.
It's all relative.
Yeah, I was going to say, given our current level of scientific understanding regarding aging, it is indeed better to continue to mature than to find the process significantly disrupted.
That's true.
Perhaps by the cessation of all biological functions. So I'm with Jim on this. Okay, enough bleak banter. Back to BFR. In the context of sarcopenia, that's what I was wanting to talk about. It's well established that age-related reductions in muscle mass are mainly attributed to the atrophy of fast-twitch muscle fibers. And this research has shown that you can absolutely increase fast twitch fiber through resistance training. And this increase is largely type 2 muscle fiber hypertrophy. So where I was going with this is, does BFR influence adaptations in specific muscle fiber types, given what you said earlier? What keyed this off is you were earlier talking about fatiguing out the slow to fatigue muscles and then getting into the fast twitch muscles. Could you talk a little about that? You did before, but a little bit in the context of sarcopenia.
Firstly, I'll start with the summary thing. For seniors and for baby boomers, this BFR training is a godsend. It is a way to address this sarcopenia. It is a way to address functional living, activities of daily living, and it is well used in Japan for these reasons. And so much so that they take people that are wheelchair bound or housebound and need help in the home to just get through the day, to being able to go to the store on their own and everything else. And so it really is a huge thing in terms of improving functional capacity, and it has been well used in Japan. The idea here is one that we touched on earlier, and as you, with these easy weights, you start to recruit, let's say, the slow twitch fiber and the first motor units that normally are there, but you put them into a fatigue state and a failure state by not letting them get the blood flow that they need. And the body does what it does under other circumstances, where it just starts recruiting a greater and greater percentage of the fiber population to end up getting the job done. And in this way, you can contract these type 2 fibers, type 2X, and all this sort of stuff. And there's been some nice work done in Scandinavia by some colleagues at the University of Gothenburg and the Norwegian University of Sport in Oslo, where they have shown that they are recruiting and getting they get stem cell activation as well as conversion of 2X fibers into 2A fibers. This particular paper was published in July of 2015.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So we've been talking about sarcopenia, but there's speculation that blood flow restriction training might also have an effect on ligament and bone strength as well. What are your thoughts on these changes with blood flow restriction training?
Absolutely. And there's good data on stimulating bone turnover and bone repair. There's a couple papers on that. And the one thing that is missing from the literature is something that demonstrates that tendon has improved in strength from blood flow restriction training. And some coaches are concerned that they're getting big muscles and they may be getting more blood vessels and better bone, but the tendons are sitting there because the tendons, they think, respond to these absolute loads. I don't happen to agree with them, but at this point, it's one of the unknown, unstudied questions. We're also about to start a study where we put microdialysis catheters into Achilles and patella tendons and then do blood flow restriction training. And we're hopeful to see that we're increasing markers of tendon turnover in those things. But again, that data is not in yet. What I believe, and have data for some of this, is that the whole motor unit and everything that's involved in the motor unit in that particular exercise ends up getting stimulated. From bone to tendon to muscle to blood vessels is upregulated and made to respond to these new demands of maximal exercise, and that all of these processes are stimulated by this systemic hormonal response that's coming out that is going everywhere.
That's really interesting. It also seems like it'd be a really useful approach for people who are either rehabbing or coming back from a serious injury or something where they can't lift heavy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. There's a paper that talks specifically about using this to avert the atrophy normally associated with ACL tears and subsequent repairs. And it's a big problem because in normal situations, athletes are usually not able to get back to playing after an ACL tear for about a year. And a big part of that is because the minute they tear their ACL, they can't exercise the way they used to, and their quads disappear in very short order. Then they get operated on, and now they have a healing ACL ligament or graft, and they again can't use their quads and associated muscles. With all of these ACL injuries, there's very dramatic quad atrophy on the side of the injury. And one of the big things in rehab is, you're looking to get those thighs back to the same circumference and the same strength on a variety of strength training tests. And we've had, there is one paper in the literature that was done in Japan, but I've had personal experience with a lot of injured athletes. And we mitigate the atrophy almost completely. And one recent example is Ted Ligety, who's one of our gold medalists in giant slalom in the Sochi Olympics. Another example is a guy named Josh Saunders, who's a goalkeeper for New York City FC, the MLS team. They both had ACL tears, and they both had repairs, and they both did blood flow restriction training as part of their rehab. They were back in around 5 months to doing what they were doing. And it was about half the time that it took. I also had occasion to work with one of our Nordic combined Olympians, a guy named Todd Lodwick, who had fallen on a ski jump and had fractured, he had a comminuted fracture of a humeral head, and he tore his rotator cuff, and he broke a couple ribs and some other things. But he did this 4 weeks before the start of the Sochi Olympics. He was going to be on our Olympic team, and this is a season-ending injury, and we thought all hope was lost. He was told that the right thing to do would be to operate on it and come back again, but he was 37, and this was his last shot at it. And so we ended up using blood flow restriction training, doing it twice a day. He hurt himself on a Friday, and he was over in Germany, and he flew back on Saturday, and Sunday he got a bunch of studies, and Monday we started doing blood flow restriction training twice a day. And long story short, he competed in his 6th Olympic Games 40 days after his fall on a ski jump, and we had serial x-rays along the way which showed that his shoulder or his humerus was healing well and in very short order.
Wow.
And he ended up being able to compete in the Olympics and doing as well as if he had not had the injury.
That's amazing. I never heard of a recovery that fast.
Yeah.
You know what he did? He had the gall he got elected flag bearer for the American team in the opening ceremonies. And that guy carried the flag in his left arm,
Wow.
which is the arm that he had the fracture in, just to kind of annoy me, and say,
I love that guy. He should have been a wrestler, not a skier.
That's awesome.
That's amazing. In a much more mundane context, I find blood flow restriction exercise super useful when traveling. You go to a hotel and they have little pink weights and blue weights and very poor equipment or no equipment. And push-ups are amazing with blood flow restriction. And as you mentioned earlier, even light weights can provide a tremendous challenge.
Yeah, with certain brands, you can, these things travel well with you, and your hotel room becomes your workout room. And you can get a full functional workout with very little extra equipment and in very short order. So, and another thing to say about the seniors and the baby boomers is that, this ends up being a kind of maximal form of strength training. But if you tried to do that with seniors and baby boomers, they'd be hurting themselves all the time.
Right.
So because you're using these light loads, everybody's able to do it.
Yeah,
and they're not hurting themselves.
That's at the heart of my interest in the subject is how to help other folks as they continue to mature to exercise and not hurt themselves.
Yeah, Dr. Seto calls blood flow restriction anti-aging medicine.
Yeah.
That's interesting. In addition to excellent hydration, do you recommend any particular supplements such as creatine or nitric oxide boosters or beta-alanine as particularly efficacious in the context of blood flow restriction? So I'm not asking in the general sense, but in particular in the context of blood flow restriction.
Well, beta-alanine is actually interesting because if you're improving intracellular buffering, that actually works against creation of this disturbance of homeostasis in the tissue with blood flow restriction. And I think the general case of beta-alanine is that it allows people to do more work and keep their tissues within homeostasis, and that's the advantage there. In the case of blood flow restriction, you're trying to get that disturbance of homeostasis.
Right.
And so I think acutely, if you've been taking beta alanine and you have your levels up so your intracellular buffers are better, then it probably makes it more difficult to get to that point of fatigue and failure, although you still need to and you still can. I think long term, then the other benefits of beta alanine end up coming in, or the chronic effects or the buffering effects. And so then whatever performances these people are doing are aided by that, and they've been aided by the training that's been going on. So I think it ends up being a bit of a wash, but it's kind of interesting biochemistry to think that at least the intracellular buffers are working against what the blood flow restriction training is trying to do. With respect to creatine and other kinds of anabolic supplements, I think there's no special effect of BFR on them or with them or vice versa. However, I think that the nutritional environment is critical to what kinds of adaptation that you're going to get. So if you want to get big, if you want to be a bodybuilder, then you need the nutritional component that does that to go along with the blood flow restriction training. Where if you're a marathon runner and you just want to get really super fit, then you need the nutritional aspects that will allow you to get fit, or maybe you take your beta alanine so you can run at a faster pace and keep things under control. So the combination of exercise and nutrition is critical for specific outcomes for all kinds of exercise, I think, but in particular blood flow restriction training.
In 2012, Hackney et al. From Johnson Space Center published an article in Extreme Physiology and Medicine, which reviews the potential of blood flow restriction specifically in the context of human spaceflight. And as you know, NASA is contemplating long-duration deep space missions. One would think that blood flow restriction would be the object of intense study on ISS, for example, with an eye toward taking it on a Mars mission or a mission to Phobos. Your thoughts on this?
I think you're absolutely right, and I can't understand why it's not being done. I really like the Hackney paper, and these are people down at Johnson Space Center. They end their paper and their conclusions saying that both BFR resistance and aerobic exercise prescription can end up being efficacious on spaceflight missions, but at the time we're not doing it. And they have I think it's FRED or ARED, which is a big, massive exercise device that they take for resistance training up on the space station. And think about how your KATSU unit there ends up weighing maybe a kilo. And what that means in terms of what you want to have up in spaceflight as opposed to something that's probably, at least 100 kilo, if not more.
No, it's 2,000 pounds.
Okay.
Yeah,
and
there's a big difference between the two.
Yeah. In fact, here at IHMC, we're working on new exercise technologies for space that would be perfect coupled with BFR.
It's the perfect countermeasure because you don't need to have the big resistances, and it mitigates the bone loss. It mitigates the muscle loss. To me, it's an absolute no-brainer that this BFR is a component of long-term space missions.
So, Jim, just from your experience, do you think there's any particular sport or type of athlete that seems best adapted to blood flow restriction training?
No, I think there's efficacious use of BFR for all different kinds of sports, from strict power sports to endurance sports to game sports like soccer and football and basketball. Pretty much everybody can find a way to make good use of this if the instruction is correct. So, I think we went through a thing maybe in the 60s and 70s where strength training per se became the rage. Before that, they really weren't doing much specific strength training. Mm-hmm. And these days, pretty much every sport, there's a component of strength training. And now I think that BFR training can be a good adjunct to traditional strength training, mm-hmm. and really get many more maximal stimuli than they're able to do in a safer way than they were able to do in the past. And so I I think pardon the pun, the sky's the limit with all this, and maybe even space is the limit with the uses of BFR in all sports. And another interesting aspect is now we've got all these high school teachers who are coaches, and they take these junior high kids who have never weight trained before, and they put them in the gym, and then all these little macho guys, the girls are good, but there's all these teenage guys seeing how much weight they can lift, and they hurt themselves.
Yep.
And here they can be taught to do the moves in the correct way with very light loads and still get a very effective stimulus for their sport. And so I think this really has a place in middle schools and high schools in terms of as you're first introducing a young athlete into strength training.
If you want to raise some eyebrows, bring your Katsu equipment to the local gym. And you see these guys looking, look at that dude, he's using 10 pounds. And it's killing him. It's killing him.
And what you ought to do is you ought to go and say, well, give us a try. You're a strong guy. Give this a try.
So, Jim, I understand that the skier Bodie Miller is an advocate for blood flow restriction training. Have you ever worked directly with him?
Oh, yes.
Yep.
Bodie and I are good friends, have been for years. I had occasion to use BFR training with him. After the Sochi Olympics, or for a long time, he's been having a lot of chronic back problems. He got through the Olympics and then had a summer that was very frustrating in that his back was always flaring up on him. He had seen Todd, the guy that carried the flag, do so well in the Sochi Olympics, and Bodie said, "Hey Jim, what do you think this stuff is? Is there a place for me with this?" And I said, "You bet." And we started training and stuff like that. And his comment was, "Wow, this is fantastic. If I had been doing this since I was a kid, I wouldn't have these back injuries or these other things that are going on, and I would be just as strong as ever." And a number of the alpine skiers that I was working with, after they were doing the set things where we were using this kind of like frosting on the cake to their traditional strength training workouts, they would take these things out onto the hills, and they were saying that this is the only way they could get the same feelings of fatigue that they would get going down these race courses at 90 miles an hour. And A, there's not a lot of snow that's prepared that way, and B, it's dangerous to do this. So now we can just put our BFR bands on and go down some easy slope and still get the same training stimulus. And so Bodie was doing this, and then his disc continued to flare up, and he ended up having a microdiscectomy in December of 2014. But the World Championships were in Vail in early February of 2015. And so all Bodie did was BFR training first twice a day as dryland training, and then he started getting out onto some snow, and so was BFR plus some normal alpine training runs with a little bit of alpine skiing with BFR bands. And he ended up being able to come back and compete in the Vail World Championships in 2015. Now, one of the things that happened is in his first race, which is a Super G, he ended up hitting a gate about 2/3 of the way down and crashing. But he would have won a medal in that race had he done that. His times were ahead of the people who were first up until his run. And he was skiing amazingly well for not having to be doing anything essentially 2 months after having a microdiscectomy. Now, the other thing is that when he crashed badly, and one of his skis came across the back of his other leg and cut his hamstring. Oh. And he had a big laceration on his calf. And this ended up being surgically repaired, and not supposed to move, not supposed to do anything. But I started doing BFR with him, and we got him back to where he was walking normally in 2 weeks after
Wow.
lacerating this tendon, and he's come back really fast.
Wow. So using it at multiple levels then, that's really impressive. On a personal note, can you tell us about your role with the U.S. Athletic Trust?
Yeah, on a personal level. The way that happened 28 years ago or something like that, 29. August Wolf, who heads the USA Athletic Trust, who was a shot putter in the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984, got a fourth place. He had moved to Dallas, and he and I had both been invited to an Olympians reception, and we met there, and we got to be great friends, and then for a period of time, he was my roommate in a house that we were renting in Dallas, and then I ended up getting married. He ended up getting kicked out of the house, and he moved back to Wall Street. And then while he was there, our friendship had continued. He was one of my groomsmen in our wedding, and so we've been friends for a long time. And as we've moved as he created this USA Athletic Trust, he was looking for kind of the science guy to help with that, and he tapped me for that.
Fantastic.
And it's been a lot of fun helping him help athletes. And it started out being something for Ivy League athletes. There's kind of a big crisis. You know, if you're a Bodie Miller and you're making a lot of money doing your sport, you're set. But if you're just coming out of college and there's nothing there for you, and you're on the threshold of being able to make it, and you're staring at whether or not you ought to grow up and get a real job, or you want to take your sport a little farther, Augie, I should say Mr. Wolf, Augie had said, okay, I think that's somewhere where I can help, where you have people coming out of colleges, they have athletic potential, but they just don't have the support they need to continue doing that.
That's fantastic.
So that's what the USA Athletic Trust is about.
That's so great. So we're going to put up a link to the USA Athletic Trust on our website in the show notes. And Jim, I just want to say this is absolutely fantastic interview. A lot of fun talking to you.
Likewise, it was really good.
Yeah. Thanks very much. It was fun to do.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Well, that was a really cool interview, and what a fascinating career Jim has had and what an impact he's made on the sports and human performance communities. I think rumor has it that the Double Secret Selection Committee has it up for a vote to have him back on the podcast.
I've heard the same thing, and of course every vote of the Double Secret Selection Committee must be unanimous.
Of course.
Of course.
If you enjoyed this interview as much as we did, I invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes, stemtalk.us. This is Dawn Carnegie signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.